Good evening, everyone. Before I begin the shir, so I would just like to say that at the end of the shir, Nechama and Amiro will be available for questions and answers regarding the seminar, which we're going to have at the end of December. Who am I? The complexity of identity in the 21st century. And this year is actually not meant to be necessarily a promo for for the seminar, but it turns out that the topic which I'm dealing with today really has to do with who am I? And in particular, what I'd like to examine is Yaakov. Last week we spoke about Jacob in terms of being, on the one hand, a symbol of Jews in the Galut, and seeing his struggles when he runs away from Esav and is by Lavan, and also mentioning that his unique contribution to the Jewish people was in establishing a home, establishing the rubric for the Jewish people by having the 12 tribes. And today what I'd like to do is to explore who is he really? And the fact that in our Parsha, he undergoes a name change from Yaakov, from Jacob, to Israel. And maybe I'd like to actually begin by saying it's very, very interesting when you look at the three patriarchs in terms of the question of their names. Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs who is given that name and retains that name throughout. Abraham starts out as Avram, and then in chapter 17, his name is changed to Avraham, to the point where in the Gemara it says that anybody who calls him Avram from that point on is actually violating a positive commandment, as a way of saying that he's undergone this name change. He's a different person right now. And what's fascinating with Jacob is that although he undergoes a name change in our Parsha and is called Israel, yet we see from this point on, this Parsha, throughout the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis, that he's constantly going back and forth between being referred to as Jacob versus Israel. And in fact, in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, page 13, it says that when his name is changed, it's not that his name, his original name, Jacob, was uprooted, but rather that he had a new name which was given to him additionally, namely Israel. So what I'd like to do today is to actually explore his different names and what does it say about his personality. So let's start with the first time we encountered Jacob, which is when he was born and actually given his name. So if you look in Breshit, chapter 25, verse 25, we're going to be looking essentially at verse 26, but let's start with verse 25. So we have the following. Vayetze harishon admoni kulo ke'aderet seyar vayikre'u shemo Esav. We have Rivka has twins, and then the time comes for her to give birth, and then the first child comes out. Okay, he is like, the general translation is a hairy mantle, like a cloak, okay? And they call him Esav. And then in verse 26, it says, V'achrechen yatsa achiv, and then subsequently his brother comes out, V'yado ochezet ba'akev Esav, and his hand is holding on, one might even say holding fast to the heel of Esav, Vayikra Shmo Yaakov, and he called him Jacob. Okay, now by the way, it's actually very interesting, and Rashi brings this on this verse. Who is calling him Jacob? And who actually gave the name to Esav? Now, the simple way of taking the text is that Esav is actually being named by them. Who's them? Well, the assumption would be his two parents, Yitzchak and Rivka. Although there are commentaries who want to say that he was given his name by everyone around there. It's like everyone who saw him when he came out immediately said, this is an Esav. With Jacob, it's Vayikra, which is in the singular. And here the simple reading would be that the one who gave him his name is his father, Yitzchak, masculine, singular. On the other hand, you find midrashim that say that actually it was God who gave him this name. Now, I'm just bringing that up because I think it's interesting. But right now, I mean, I think in the end, in true Jewish fashion, they may all be true. But for the moment, we're going to work with the assumption that he's given his name by his father, Yitzchak. And why is he called Yaakov? Now, the simple way of reading the text is obviously there's a play on words over here that he's called Yaakov because he's holding on to the heel, okay, and holding fast to the heel of Esav. By the way, I just want to point out, and a number of commentaries actually say this, that it's interesting that his name is not Okev, which is, let's say, for example, in the present tense, or maybe something that refers to a past event, but Yaakov, which is future. And I'll just say this, I mentioned that, when I teach and when I taught in the regular program, so I actually would say to people very often that when you have something in the Torah, which is in the future tense, you could either see it as being the future, or you could see it as something which is an ongoing phenomenon, which is an ongoing present. And the point which I would like to make with that is, which is not my original point, but what a number of commentaries say, is that what is happening right now is not just, oh, I want to commemorate what happened at birth. But in fact, what happened at birth may very well be something that will keep on going in the future. And maybe this is something which is very much characteristic of Yaakov. So now what is it? Yaakov is now holding on to the heel of his brothers. Now, generally the assumption, which I assume not only of commentaries, but of most people, is that he's holding on to his foot because he's trying to hold him back, because he's the one who's going out. And as Rashi brings up the Midrash, and there's this struggle which is going, who's going to be the first one to get out? Who will have the birthright? And so holding on to his foot is because Esav is already on his way out. He's holding on to his ankle to try to pull him back. And if you take that interpretation, so then it would come out that maybe this is already kind of indicative of a certain struggle which is going to be later on between Yaakov and Esav, and where Yaakov is somehow going to hold back Esav, is not going to allow Esav, or at least attempt to try to now somehow keep him in his tracks. Ultimately with the idea that maybe he will be the one who will come out first. Now that's generally the assumption that you have. And by the way, let me take that assumption and maybe even give it a certain twist, okay? And, in particular, the idea of holding him by the ankle, okay, because we're all familiar with the idea of, an Achilles heel, right? And this idea of vulnerability. Try to find someone's weak point and then take advantage of it. And then, so it's not only he's trying to hold him back, but in particular, he's trying to hold him back by finding his weak point and, in effect, quote unquote, to trip him up. Now, I want to suggest, now all of that would then be based on the assumption that, and there's a good basis for this, to say that there seems to be a lot of movement in Rivka's womb, okay? And maybe that movement is very much associated with a struggle which is going on. And then that struggle finds expression even when Esav comes out, and here is Yaakov who's trying to pull him back, and maybe even trying to, as I said, find his weak point to be able to do that. And to a great extent, this may be setting the stage for what we're going to see later on. And maybe I'll just use this charged word right now because we're going to certainly be speaking about it, that it's already setting the stage for maybe Yaakov being somebody who's manipulative. I want to suggest a different possibility now. Oh, by the way, before I get to the second possibility, if you want to adopt that approach for a moment, okay, there's actually a very interesting parallel which perhaps can be drawn, and that is from the Garden of Eden. So, for example, if you look at the Garden of Eden story, this is chapter 3, right, in Bereshit, right after the Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge, and then God is addressing the snake, and God says to the snake, okay, you are cursed. You will basically walk, okay, on your stomach. You will eat the dust of the ground. And what I'm interested in is looking in chapter 3 in verse 15, where it says, the Eva Ashit, and I will place enmity Beincha uvein ha'isha, between you and the woman, bein zaracha uvein zar'a, between your seed and her seed, hu yishufcha rosh, v'ata tishufenu akev. Okay? Now, generally, the way almost all the commentaries understand it is that there will be this enmity between humanity and between the snake. And then what will happen is the seed of humanity will crush the head, right? The skull of the snake. And the snake will somehow respond by attacking the heel of the, and again, it makes a lot of sense. You're attacking the heel because the snake is, groveling on the ground, right? And is not able to stand upright. So the only way that you can get at the person is by, attacking their heel. Now, why am I bringing up this verse? Because here we speak about the heel. Okay, and so here I have a very interesting parallel, right? Jacob is holding on to the heel of Esav. Here I have the snake, which is attacking the heel of people. Now, if you take it from that perspective and you want to take it to its logical conclusion, then there's a very interesting parallel that Jacob now becomes like a snake. But I would just like to point out one thing right now, which I think is very important. If you go back to the original story of their birth, okay, this is in chapter 25. And when Rivka is, she's inquiring what's going on in her stomach. So she's told the following. Shnei, this is chapter 25, verse 23. She's told, Shnei goyim bevitnech. There are two nations in your stomach. Shnei le'umim. Two, and here I'll translate the word le'umim as it's also nation, but it's, as many commentaries say, nations that have majesty, have sovereignty. Not just being a nation, but being a sovereign nation. It might even be an expression of power. So there are these two powerful nations, mi me'ayichi paredu, that will separate from your innards. And then we have the next phrase, ulaom milaom ye'ematz v'rav ya'avod sa'ir. Now, this expression, which I think most people will probably translate a certain way, if you really read it carefully, you'll see it's very ambiguous. Now, generally, the way people read it is ulaom milaom ye'ematz, which means that there will be a fight between these two nations. And by the way, this has midrashic roots. Okay, it goes back to the rabbis of the time of the Mishnah, who keep on saying that, in other words, there's always going to be this power struggle. Okay, whenever Esav is on top, Jacob will be, okay, when Rome is affluent, is succeeding, Israel will be in a state of ruins, and vice versa. Which means there's always going to be this sense of enmity and always this sense that, in other words, these two nations are always, each one is going to be in a conflict, but not only conflict, they're in competition with each other. And then when it says at the end, v'rav ya'avod sa'ir, so usually it's translated, and the greater one will serve the younger one. Okay, now, if you give that interpretation, then that would really reinforce the parallel in a certain way that I made between the story of the snake. That we're describing a situation where there's a certain enmity, there's a certain conflict, and in the end, what's going to happen is that, in other words, the younger one is somehow going to come out on top. But what I wanted, the reason why I brought this pasuk is I want you to see that in the pasuk, it never uses the word enmity, as it does in the case of the snake. In the snake, it says eva, enmity, hatred. Here, there's no sense of hatred. In fact, I'm going to give you an original interpretation. You can blame me if anybody asks you. Ulaom milaom ye'ematz, one nation from another nation will become courageous, which means that rather than saying one nation will be in conflict and will rise up at the expense of the other one, maybe it means one will empower the other one. And maybe there's actually the possibility of each one empowering the other. And by the same token, v'rav ya'avod sa'ir, maybe I don't necessarily have to see as enslaving or subjugating, but maybe serving. And maybe what it's saying is, and it's also not clear, is it Rav Ya'avod Sa'ir, is the subject Sa'ir or is the object Sa'ir? Who is serving whom? And maybe in the end, we could say, maybe depending on the situation, each one will serve the other. Each one can learn from the other. Each one can reinforce the other. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because what I want you to see is that when Jacob initially gets his name and the whole circumstances surrounding his birth, I don't necessarily have to see this being a foreshadowing of a conflict which involves a lot of enmity, and where each one is now vying at the expense of the other. And in a certain sense, it might be reflecting, okay, what happened in the story of the snake between this conflict which has been introduced into the world between humanity and the snake. Maybe I could read this and it has the at least potential to be that there will be two different types of entities who actually could reinforce each other, who could strengthen each other, who would serve each other, but not in a negative sense, but actually in a positive sense. And now you'll probably thinking like, why am I talking about all this? And what does this have to do with Yaakov? So now I want to actually give you another interpretation about this idea of Yado ochezet ba'akev Esav, that his hand is holding on to the heel of Esav. And the interpretation is, and again, you can blame me for this. I did this last week, and I hope I don't get too much into this routine of trying to look at biblical Hebrew in light of modern Hebrew. But if people are familiar with modern Hebrew, the word okev, I can't, yeah, I have to, I'm sorry, you'll excuse me for not answering. I'll have to say this as a rhetorical question, just so that we make this easier. I'm sorry for not being interactive. But the word okev in modern Hebrew means to follow, to be on somebody's tracks, right? Sometimes it's the word for a stalker. Okay, but you could also use the word, for example, following somebody on Instagram, being on their heels, which I don't have to necessarily take as something negative, but it could be something that I am, observing what they're doing, and I'm maybe even trying to imitate them. Now, why am I bringing this up? And we're not going to go into a whole analysis today about this. I mean, that's a whole other shiur. But there's a very interesting parallel between the story of Yaakov and Esav and Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel. We have two sets of twins where there seems to be a lot of enmity. And not only that, but where in the first case, in Cain and Abel, so Cain clearly kills his brother. Esav, as we know from a few weeks ago, wants to kill Jacob. And we're going to talk about that more a little bit later in terms of our Parsha. Now, that's how these stories are parallel. But I want to bring up an interesting idea that, how did the whole story of Cain and Abel begin? Well, Cain is somebody who's, works in the field, like Esav, who works in the field. Hevel is a shepherd. Jacob is a shepherd. And Cain then decides to bring an offering to God, except that it wasn't so great. And then his brother also brings an offering. And if you look at the verse in chapter 4, I think it's verse 2, 3, it says that, in other words, he also brought an offering, except that his is better. Now, why am I bringing it up? Because it could very well be that in that story, Cain is the one who takes the lead. His brother is the one who observes him, who follows him, and who also wants to do what he did, except to do it his way. And not only his way, but he did it even better. And what I want to suggest is maybe that's something that could have theoretically been true about Yaakov and Esav. That maybe Esav is somebody who's a very, very charismatic figure. He's a man of the field. He clearly has his father's attention. And maybe Yaakov is somebody who observes, who follows, who tries to get some pointers from his brother, who's not necessarily stalking him, not necessarily trying to somehow trip him up, but might be somebody who actually he could learn from. Now, I realize I'm waiting for all the comments, but I realize that, in other words, that but you don't really see that in the text. But I'm just saying, theoretically, that could have been the scenario. So now I want to get to what do we see in the text. And in fact, what we see in the text is two stories in Parashat Toldot of Jacob, who essentially is manipulative. And where this idea of ochezet, ba'akei v'esav. By the way, also, I just want to say, when I compared it to the story of the snake, by the snake, it talks about, where the snake is breathing down on your heel. And most commentaries say that what that means is, like, just before the snake is about to attack you, you hear this hiss, and then all of a sudden it bites you. But with Jacob, I don't have this idea of Jacob attacking his heel. He's holding on to his heel. He's grabbing it, which, as I said before, doesn't necessarily have to be something which is negative. But when we read the two stories in Parashat Toldot, it does very much take a negative turn. And now I want to look at the second story, which is very familiar, when Jacob, quote unquote, steals the blessing, and look at, his brother's reaction. So if you look at chapter 27, verse 35, and the one that I want to see even more is 36. Okay, in verse 35, right? After Jacob has gotten the blessing, right? Masquerading as his brother. And then he leaves, and then all of a sudden Esav comes in, and Esav says, "Here I am, Daddy. I brought you all this food. Now give me a blessing." And then in verse 35, it's Yitzchak. Isaac's response is, "Ba achicha b'mirma." Your brother came in deception. He took your blessing. And then the key to me is verse 36. Vayomer, and then Esav says, Hachi kara shmo Yaakov. So is this why you called him Jacob? Vayakveni ze pa'amayim. He has healed me twice. Et bechorati lakach. V'hinei ata lakach birchati. The first time he took, right, the birthright, and the second, and right now he's taken my blessing. If anybody wants to look at Rashi's commentary there, Rashi says, what is Vayakveni? I translated, obviously Vayakveni is a play on Jacob's name, Yaakov. And Rashi says, according to the Aramaic translation, the Kamani, Arvani means he lay in ambush. It's like he was waiting, right, to ambush me, to be able to now attack me and to ultimately undermine me. He exploited me, right? Now, again, you take the first story, right, where Esav comes from the field and where he's very tired, where he's very hungry, okay, and says to Jacob, give me that red stuff over there. And Jacob's response is, sure, I'll be happy to do that. Just sell me a birthright. And right now, here is Jacob, who essentially has masqueraded, right? And not only that, to add insult to injury, right? That Rivka gave him Esav's clothes, his special clothes, which were lying in her custody. And so here clearly, when Esav is looking at Jacob's name, for him, what does that name mean? That name means the one who is deceptive, the one who is lying in ambush. And in fact, it's even interesting how Jacob says, oh, so this is why you called him Jacob. In other words, it's the idea as if you gave him this name, which in a certain sense put him on a certain course of action, right? And it's as if everything that he's done has been a fulfillment, a self-fulfillment of the prophecy of his name. His name has determined his destiny. And what's that destiny? To be somebody who is a deceptive person. And by the way, that would fit in with the previous sentence, right, which I read, which is that Yitzchak says, your brother has come in deception. And so what I want you to see is when you look at, Parashat Toldot, where we have the first glimpses of who is Jacob, we see that somehow his name is very much connected with this idea of deception. Not only of holding back Esav, holding his heel so that he can't move forward, but as I said, tripping him up, finding his weak point, using it to his advantage. That's what I had in Parashat Toldot. And it's not a very favorable picture of Jacob. And it certainly raises a question, this is the patriarch. This is, the person that, is ultimately who we're named after. And the question is, why? Why did he do it? How could he do it? And especially since I said to you that his name, Yaakov, following Esav, right? He's observing him. Maybe he's even learning from him. So how did he go from that to manipulating his brother? And what I would like to suggest, which I think is very clear in last week's Parsha and even more so in our Parsha this week, is that Jacob is actually afraid, overwhelmed. You might say intimidated. He's very afraid of his, and I want to start with his brother, Esav. And there's a certain dissonance over here between, on the one hand, looking at his brother and maybe realizing his brother is not the one to be carrying on the mantle, right, of the legacy of Abraham, and yet not being able to stand up. In the end, if he recourse is to be deceptive, is to try to find Esav's weak spot. And now what I'd like to do, are people hearing me now? I just saw my internet is unstable. So if you could just show me that you're hearing me. Okay, good. Look at last week's Parsha. Last week's Parsha is extremely important on a whole other level, which I did not discuss last week. And that is the dynamics of the relationship between Jacob, between Yaakov and Lavan. And now what I want to suggest, and again, as I said, you can blame me for this, but I'm speculating in an area, right, where we don't have hard and fast rules, that maybe if Jacob actually observed Esav, he actually acquired the tools of dealing with Lavan, except that he dealt with Lavan in a different way than he dealt with Esav. And one of the things which is very striking in last week's Parsha is that Jacob actually is not at all deceptive. In everything that he does, he's very upfront from the very beginning. When after he's been by his father-in-law for a month, and then Lavan says, well, okay, let's try to arrange some sort of business agreement. And then Jacob says, okay, I'd like to, work for your daughter 7 years. And he also makes it clear which daughter he wants. And he actually comes through in everything that he committed himself to. And it's Lavan, in the end, who is deceptive. If you look at in last week's Parashat in the beginning, when after Lavan gives Leah to Jacob, and it's only the following day that Jacob discovers that he's somehow married the wrong person, which I'm not going to get into right now. That's a whole other question in itself. But if you look at chapter 29, verse 25. So in the morning, all of a sudden, Jacob discovers it's Leah, and he says to Lavan, what have you done to me? Didn't I work for Rachel? Why have you deceived me? By the way, it's as if, this is karma. This is, what goes around comes around. Yitzchak said about Jacob, Ba achicha b'mirma, your brother came deceptively. And now Jacob is saying to Lavan, why did you deceive me? And the rabbis have a field day. They said, of course he deceived you, because this is part of a divine plan to punish you for your deception. Okay, but what matters to me for the moment is that Jacob is very upfront with Lavan. Even subsequently, when the time comes after Joseph is born, and in last week's Parsha, Jacob says to Lavan, okay, I'd like to go back now. And then Lavan starts saying to him, this is chapter 30, okay, verses 25, okay, subsequently, where Lavan says, no, I don't want to really let you go because you brought a blessing to my house. So then tell me, what would you like in terms of the terms of your employment? And then Jacob gives him a very clear, right, what you might say, description of what he would like the terms of employment to be, okay? How they will have the allocation of resources. And what happens, and we learn this later on, is that in fact, at each turn, Lavan changes the terms of employment. Which means that Jacob throughout is not at all deceptive. He's very upfront with Lavan, with one exception. And if you look in chapter 31, verse 19, 31:19, this is last week's Parashat, it says, V'Lavan halach, Lavan went, ligzozet sono, to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole these trafim, these amulets that belonged to her father. But the next verse is Vayignov Yaakov et leiv Lavan, that Jacob stole the heart of Lavan because he didn't tell him, and this is what's key, ki boreachu, that he's running away. And then in the next verse it says, Vayivrachu v'chol hashelo, he ran away from Lavan, which means that Jacob was completely upfront with Lavan up to this point. The point being, when Jacob came to the decision, together with his wives, that the time has come for him to leave, and it's based on the fact that God appeared to him and said to him, go back now, rather than going to Lavan and said, my God appeared to me and told me to go back, it was nice knowing you, okay? Jacob runs away. And not only does he run away, he steals the heart, which is a very, how should I put this, very loaded term. Okay, and it's using that word is kind of comparable to what it says about Rachel stealing these amulets, these charms of her father. As a way of it's actually a condemning word of what Jacob has done. And once again, there's the question, why? And that actually becomes very interesting when you go down a few more verses. After Lavan chases after Jacob, and God appears to Lavan and says, don't try to start up with him. And then Lavan confronts Jacob. And he says to him, why did you run away? Okay, and and I could really do all kinds of things to you, but your God told me to leave you alone. Look at chapter 31, verse 31. What's Jacob's response? Vayan Yaakov, vayomer lelavan. Jacob responds and says, Ki yareti, I was afraid. Ki amarti, because I said, Pentigzolet benatecha me'imi, lest you steal your daughters from me. Okay? So once again, I said this to you before. I said by Esav that Jacob is somehow intimidated by Esav, even though in Parashat Toldot, I don't have any basis for saying that. You'll see why I say that in another few minutes. But here, it's very clear that Jacob himself says to Lavan, I ran away because I was afraid of you. I was afraid that you would steal your daughters. By the way, if I connect this with what we discussed last week, if Jacob's crowning achievement, right, for the whole period that he was by Lavan was to build a family, his greatest fear is that that family will be taken away from him. So I don't want to minimize, the fact that he's afraid. It's like, here I am. I worked so hard to build something. I don't want to lose it. And he really feels that Lavan has the capacity to take it away from him. But I want to now move a few verses at the end of last week's Parsha, and I promise you I'll get to this week's Parsha, where it says, where Lavan accused Jacob, right, of stealing his amulets. He didn't find them. And when he doesn't find them, then all of a sudden we have in verse 36 that Jacob gets angry. He actually now argues, fights with Lavan in verse 36. And he says, what is my crime? What is my sin that you are in hot pursuit of me? And then what he does is to give him a full accounting of what's been happening for the last 20 years. And he lays everything on the table. And he says to Lavan, you deceived me all this time. The only reason why in the end I am still in existence is because my God has been protecting me. And lo and behold, in the aftermath of this speech, Lavan says, let's make a pact. Which means that Jacob, at the end of last week's Parsha, in a certain sense, has become a different type of person. He's not somebody who's deceptive. He's somebody who for all those years was very much upfront. But at one point, it seems that he's still intimidated by Lavan and runs away and steals his heart. And when he's pushed with his back to the wall and he's accused, right, of stealing Lavan's charms, his amulets, Jacob then stands up to Lavan. He puts everything straight on the table. And in the end, Lavan backs down. And they reach a certain agreement. And Jacob is able to move forward. Now, why am I going into so much detail about all this? Because this actually sets the stage for our Parsha. And our Parsha, essentially, at least in the first opening story, is you could say the reconciliation between Jacob and Esav. Maybe what I would say is the meeting between Jacob and Esav. And the question is, on what terms is Jacob going to meet Esav? And so now, because the topic which I chose is his name, so I want to look at where his name begins to be changed. So if you look in our Parsha, and obviously the story which everybody's familiar with, is Jacob wrestling with some mysterious man. And this is in chapter 32, verse 25. Okay, Jacob, and again, just to give you the background for the moment, Jacob is on the verge of meeting his brother. His brother is coming out to him with a band of 400 men. And by the way, I don't want to minimize this. 400 men at that time is a minor or even major army, which can be very, very intimidating. And at night, when Jacob is moving his family around, at a certain point, it says, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Jacob is all alone. Vayeyavek ishimo, and a man is now struggling with him. Aralot, until the morning. And when this man is not able to somehow overpower Jacob, this is verse 26, he touches him by the palm of his thigh, and then Jacob's thigh goes out. And then that man says, send me away. And Jacob says, I won't until you give me a blessing. And what's the blessing? Your name is, you will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And why are you being called Israel? Because you have Sarita, this is verse 29, 32:29. Sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim vatuchal. Now the word Sarita is related to the word Sar, which means prince. You have shown, maybe what I would say, majesty vis-a-vis people and vis-a-vis God, or vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis people. And you have succeeded, you have triumphed, you have overcome. Actually, the word vatuchal, if I even wanted to be more literal, you can do it. You did it. You're able to do it. Now, I have a few podcasts where I've spoken about this, and since I'm focusing today on the names, so I'll just mention this briefly. When Jacob is about to encounter Esav, the question is, on what terms is he going to meet him? Is he going to meet him as an equal, as his brother, as someone who received the blessing and is looking for Esav to somehow acknowledge that? Or is Jacob going to be deceptive? Is Jacob going to be somehow trying to find the soft spot and capitalize on it? And so what I would like to say is the following. when we actually look at the story, and now let's look at a few verses. When Jacob hears that his brother is coming to meet him with a band of 400 men, this is chapter 32, verse 8. And this is before that incident of Jacob wrestling. It says, Vayira Yaakov ma'od. Jacob is very afraid. Vayetzer lo. He's distressed. Vayachatz. He splits up the camp which is with him, the sheep and the cattle, into two camps. And he says, Im yavo Esav el hamachaneh ha'achat v'ikau. If Esav will come to one camp and strike it down, v'haya hamachaneh hanishar lifleita, then the remaining camp will survive. Now, I mentioned to you before, right, that even in Parashat Toldot, when Jacob masquerades as his brother, when Jacob extorts his brother for the birthright, it might be that Jacob, in a way, is very intimidated by his brother and has to find his weak point and take advantage of it. Well, over here it says explicitly that Jacob is afraid of him. He's distressed. And in this case, and again, I want to link this to what I discussed last week, in the same way that Jacob ran away from Lavan because he was afraid that Lavan would take his family from him, everything that he worked for, everything that his life's mission, Jacob is afraid that Esav will kill everybody. And because of that, Jacob has to come up with a scheme how he's going to make it through here. And essentially, what he does is he prays to God, which is fine. He prepares himself, right, to what you might say, to minimize his losses, right, prepares himself militarily. But then what he does, which perhaps is where I have my problem, where Jacob sends Esav this elaborate gift in order to somehow pacify him. But now I'm going to use a loaded word, and I realize that. Perhaps to grovel before him. And in fact, if you read the beginning of the parsha, right, throughout their encounter, you will see that every time Jacob talks to his brother, he refers to Esav as being the master and he is the servant. He never refers to him as his brother. And so that Jacob has now come up with this subterfuge of how he can maybe butter up his brother and maybe lead him on to thinking all kinds of things so that he won't pose a threat to him anymore. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because the encounter with this mysterious man happens between what I just read to you and between the actual encounter with Esav. And the rabbis see this mysterious man as being an angel, a messenger of God. And what's the point over here, according to this rabbinic understanding? The messenger of God is actually now attacking Yaakov and forcing Yaakov to have to struggle. Forcing Yaakov to have to fight for his life. But even more than that, when the dawn arises and this man says, I want to go, Yaakov says, I won't let you go until you bless me. That's very interesting. And now I want to say, until you acknowledge my blessing. And what's the blessing that he gives him? You're not Jacob. You're Israel. This incident is meant to be a message to Yaakov of what should happen when he encounters his brother. And what do I mean by that? It's saying to Jacob, you have it within you to not be Jacob. You have it within you to be Israel. To be Israel, you have to be prepared to fight. You have to be prepared to fight for what you believe is true, for what you believe is right. And I want to add, not in an offensive way, but literally to stand up for yourself, to defend yourself, to not allow yourself to be trampled on, to not allow yourself to be taken advantage of. So that Esav at the end will not say like the first time around, oh, now I know why your name is Jacob. He didn't say, I know Jacob. He said to his father, oh, now I know why you called him Jacob, because that's who he is. He's a Jacob. He's somebody who's deceptive, a sneak, who's wily. No, what should happen now is that Esav should say, you're Israel. You're somebody who can now approach me as an equal, who can demand my respect, and who I will give my respect to. By the way, the word Israel, Yisrael, the way it's explained in the text is because you displayed majesty. You displayed your princeship, your lordship. But you know, Yisrael also has the word in it, yashar. You're straight. You're upfront. And so this is, in a certain sense, a different image of this individual. Rather than being Yaakov, who's on the heels of someone, who in the best of situations is perhaps trying to imitate them, be Israel, who in the end can be somebody who displays majesty, who can command majesty. And I want to just show you how the incident, right, of the man wrestling with Jacob is meant to, as I said, show him, you can do this. He actually did it before with Lavan. He did it now when he's wrestling with that man, when he said, give me a blessing. And the message is, and you can do that now when you encounter your brother. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. When Jacob actually encounters Esav, and let's just look at this. This is chapter 33. It says, chapter 33, verse 3. Jacob first has his wives and their children come and they bow down before Esav. And then Jacob does it. And it says Jacob goes ahead of them. He bows down 7 times until he comes to his brother. And if you could visualize this, it's not like 7 times in one shot. It's like he's like, about 500 meters away from him, and he bows down, and then he moves up another 50 meters and he bows down, and each time as he approaches him he bows down in succession 7 times. There's absolutely no question that the point of bowing down is to really highlight the fact he is the servant and Esav is the master. And then when he finally meets him, and Esav says to him in verse 8, what is this whole camp that I encountered, the present that he sent? And he said, to find favor in the eyes of my master. And look at what Esav says in verse 9. My brother, I have much. Keep whatever you have. My brother. And yet he doesn't pick up on that. He says to him in the next verse, he says, if I have found favor in your eyes, in verse 10, take my offering, my homage offering, mincha, my present. Why? Because seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. And I am looking for your favor, vatirtzeni, for your liking me. By the way, the word liratzon is a word that actually comes up by sacrifices. We bring sacrifices liratzot to pacify God, to be to God's well desire. So and even says, you're like God to me. And then comes the final thing where he says, verse 11, take my blessing. Kachna et birchati. So in my mind, this was actually a tragic mistake on Jacob's part. And in fact, what I would say is that had Jacob actually not called Esav my master, had he not spoken to him, you is like seeing God, had he spoke to him, my brother, I have a lot. And even though I have a lot, I'm happy that you have a lot. And maybe each of us can share with each other. And also, maybe what Jacob should have said is not take my blessing, but like happened earlier, give me a blessing. Give me a blessing, which in the end will not be just my blessing, but will be your blessing as well. And maybe, in fact, by acknowledging the blessing that Jacob received, that could actually be the basis of all of them being blessed. And now what I would suggest is, had Jacob done it differently, then it actually would have been that he would no longer be Jacob. From now on, he would be Israel. But because he didn't do it, he has this, what I would call, complex identity. He's Jacob and he's also Israel. He has the capacity to be both, and he is both. And he's constantly living in that, what I would call, struggle of who am I? There are moments when he's Israel, there are moments when he's Jacob. It's actually very interesting, and again, since this is my topic, so I just want to fill this in. He actually gets the name Israel. I mean, he's given that name over here in the, with that mysterious man, but that name is actually validated a second time in the Parsha, in the aftermath of the story of Dinah and Shem, when Jacob's sons essentially tried to save their sister and kill off a whole city. And in that aftermath, in the aftermath of that story, well, if you just look for, and this, I'll end with this, chapter 35, verse 5, it says that the brothers, the whole family then travels. And it says in verse 5, and the fear of God is on all the surrounding cities, and they don't pursue Jacob. Everybody see, specifically Jacob. Because Jacob was very afraid in the aftermath of what his sons did. That he was afraid that he would be once again, his family would be destroyed in a retaliatory attack. But it didn't happen because the fear of God was on those surrounding cities. And then if you look at verse 6, and Jacob comes to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, which is Beit El. He builds there an altar. He calls out in the name of God. Right? This is now creating a closure, closing the circle of the beginning of Parashat VaYishlach, when Jacob initially left his father's house and has the dream with the ladder. He's in Beit El. Now Jacob finally comes back to Beit El. And then look at verse 9. And God appeared to Jacob, and then he blesses him. And God says to him, your name is Jacob, but from now on, your name will not only be Jacob, but Israel. And he calls him Israel. And by the way, all of the commentaries say, when God says your name will no longer be Jacob, it doesn't mean it will no longer be Jacob. It will no longer be only Jacob. It will also be Israel. But it's interesting that God comes to him and says to him, your name will be also Israel, in the aftermath of the second story, which is the story of Shem. And I just want to end, if you look at what God then says to him in the continuation, God says to him in verse 11, I am El Shaddai, be fruitful and multiply, a nation and a community of nations will be from you, and kings will come from you. We're not going to do it now because I see I'm over time, but if you go back to when Jacob had his dream, what God said to him, right, when he was leaving his father's house, right, being pursued by Esav, about to go to his father, his future father-in-law Lavan, who was not exactly somebody wonderful to be with. God gave him a blessing there also, and he said, I'm going to give you, he essentially gave him the blessing of Abraham. But there what God said to him is, you will be like the dust of the earth. So now maybe think about this. The dust of the earth is what you trample on with your heel. But right now, what God is saying to him is, kings will come from you. Majesty. Majesty is connected with Israel. And so what I would like to say is the following, and this is the very last point. Jacob and Israel reflect two different dimensions of who this person is. Jacob is the one who perhaps is holding on to survive, who's like constantly following and looking and perhaps even, exploiting, because that's what he needs to be able to survive in a world which is terrifying. In a world where he feels that everything could potentially fall apart. Israel, Yisrael, you're a sar, you're a prince, you're majestic. You have the ability to not just survive, but to actually be recognized as being a leader, as being somebody who is worthy of being blessed. But you have to be able to have that tenacity, have that confidence that you can be that person. And what seems to be is that in Jacob's life, at various moments, he is that person. But perhaps it's only when as I said, his back is against the wall or maybe against the ground, where when he's fighting with everything that he has to survive, he displays that in the end, he can triumph. And perhaps this, as I said, complexity of identity is maybe also a model in many cases for us. Who are we? And to what extent is it that there are situations where we're very much overwhelmed by what's going on around us? And when we try to hold on just to survive and maybe even have to do things in a very manipulative way to survive because we're intimidated, we can't directly confront something? Or at what point is it that we're able to bring out our human dignity to its fullest and to be able to actually confront situations with a sense of pride, but pride not in a negative way, but a sense of dignity? And to be able to say that if there are things that we very much believe in, that we will stand up for them and we will not allow ourselves to be intimidated. And through that, receive a certain recognition, okay, of our greatness, our human grandeur. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.